Hi everyone, it's Ren here. Hope you're doing well, guys. So you can see that so far I'm not, abandoning my commitment of continuing to make videos rather than a very brief comeback and then disappearing. In this video, I would like to talk about introverted intuition. It's been a while since I've made a video about introverted intuition. And the reason why I would like to make a video about this very interesting function, and perhaps, whilst making references to other functions as well, is linked to my reading of, the work of Carl Jung on typology and typology of types. Typology of types. That sounds like a redundancy. Psychology of types, I'm sorry. Because I legitimately think now, with a bit of hindsight, that reading Jung's work has allowed me, and as I'm sure it's allowed many other people before me, to, I think, enrich and refine my understanding of introverted intuition, make it more precise, and even correct some inaccuracies, including, I believe, inaccuracies that I may have imparted to you in some previous videos. So if that's the case, well, I shall endeavor to correct them here. Now, in order to delve straight away into an introverted intuition, which I would like to do, I cannot do it straight away. Because if I do it straight away, you won't understand what I'm trying to rectify or make more precise. So that I can do this shortly, because I will attempt not to ramble too much, I first need to bring you into the vision, the perspective of Jung on the functions. I'll give you a snippet of it, because I'll have plenty more videos to explore it at more length. But let it be known that in the mind of Carl Jung, whose psychology of types was the basis of MBTI but is not identical with it, there is no such thing as a function stack. It's something that you really need to grasp and understand and appreciate if you don't know already, because that has big consequences. The function stack is an appeal in MBTI. So, for example, in the case of the INTP, let's take another type than INFJ for once. You have a function stack of introverted thinking, TI, extroverted intuition, NE, introverted sensing, SI as tertiary, and then extroverted feeling as the inferior function. So there's a really nice symmetry to the function stack in the Myers-Briggs parlance. And it's so nice and so neatly laid out that it's quite easy to relate to it, grasp it, communicate about it, and end up, in a way, essentializing our own use of those functions into ourselves in the same way that we, by relating to a label like a 4-letter code, we end up, relating to it. At least some of us may end up relating to it as if it was part of our essence. Whereas it's only a way of describing who we actually are rather than a way of capturing the essence of who we are, if you can see the difference. It's an important difference to emphasize, because as I said in one of my previous videos, it's a great way of avoiding the idea that change is impossible in terms of our personality. Now, the extent of that change, the limits of the possibility of that change, are themes that are interesting, and I want to explore them as well in later videos. But nevertheless, change can happen, and the function stack can have a funny way of both being very easy to understand and in some ways intuitive, but also limiting. And it's linked to this symmetry, this idea that if we have a dominant function that is introverted, then our auxiliary must be extroverted, then our tertiary must be introverted, and so on. That's something that Jung didn't actually write about, believe it or not. Myers-Briggs did write about it, and I think it has merits. But just to come back to Jung, in Jung's psychology of types, there are really only 8 types, not 16. Because he only talks about types as defined by their dominant function, and I'm not sure that he actually uses the term dominant function. He talks about the extroverted intuitive, the introverted intuitive, the extroverted thinker, the extroverted feeler, and so on. Introverted sensing. The chapter on introverted sensing in Jung is really fascinating. If you want to, for those who may have biases against introverted sensing, many of us do, as the kind of boring order following types. You should read the chapter that Jung writes on it. Will change your view almost completely. But in any case, Jung has only 8 types, and a direct consequence of this is that he doesn't talk about auxiliary function or tertiary function. But, and this will be important for the second part of the video, where I dedicate more time to NI, as I promised. The dominant function that Jung uses to articulate his 8 categories is quite clearly associated with an unconscious function that serves as its kind of ground, as its kind of counterpart, but it's unconscious, and the interrelationship between them can only be inferred through observation of other people, but you can't really have access to that interaction yourself. And it's very clear that that's where the concept of inferior function is born. So in a sense, auxiliary function and tertiary functions are only very vaguely and indirectly derivable from Jung, but both the dominant and the inferior are in Jung, and Jung is very clear that the inferior and the dominant, which he associates with the conscious and the unconscious, are deeply complementary and cannot function without one another. Now, they may dysfunction a bit, but they cannot not function at all without one another. And this is of great importance for the understanding of all dominant functions. But here, more specifically, I'll be talking about NI, because when I read this, it made me realize that I had made a mistake in thinking for many, many months, and maybe even years, that for an INFJ anyway, and for an INTJ, introverted intuition was unconscious. An unconscious function, so did the Ren go. An unconscious function that gathers data and organizes it into patterns. Sounds familiar, maybe. An unconscious function that gathers data and organizes it into patterns. Very well, but that's actually not completely true. What I've just described is not just introverted intuition, is introverted intuition working with extroverted sensing. And it's actually easy to show. Because, and this is a key insight, again, that I properly understood when I read Jung. Nobody in the world can function properly and in a healthy way without an extroverted perception function. You may not be a strong extroverted perceiver. You might not think of yourself as a strong extrovert perceiver. For example, an INFJ might not think of themselves as that, especially if they are under the influence of Myers-Briggs, because it's their inferior function. I guess you could also say that an ISTJ might not see themselves as a strong extrovert perceiver, given that they have an E as their inferior, and so on. But in Jung, the question is not really, or maybe even not at all, directly, whether your inferior function is strong or weak, because it's there and it's indispensable, which means that whenever you're using NI in a healthy way, SE is involved in some way also. And when it is not involved, you're kind of running NI in circles and looping it with TI, for example. Because NI is not really a gathering function, and it's not really a function that collects information. It doesn't collect information at all, actually. It can't, because it's introverted, it's subjective. You're not looking out in the world when you're using NI. You need SE to do that, or NE. And it's a fortunate thing that every single type in the Myers-Briggs parlance has an extroverted function somewhere, an extroverted perceiving function specifically, because that's how you collect the information in the outside world and do not go insane. You remain in touch. You do not become solipsistic. The question is not so much one of strength or weakness, but one of consciousness or unconsciousness. For some people, the collection of information in the outside world is very conscious, very deliberate. That's the case of any dominance and SE dominance, and to a lesser extent of any auxiliary and SE auxiliary, so ENTPs, ENFPs, etc. In the case of the NI dominance, for example, who have SE as their inferior, or even the case of SI dominance, the collection of information in the outside world is very unconscious. It's very unconscious. It doesn't mean that it's weak, but it's unconscious. And because it's unconscious, you have less control over it. And because you have less control over it, you're less likely to actively cultivate the use of it. So in a way, your proficiency at these functions might be lower, not because intrinsically they are weaker, but because you're less led to cultivate them and to improve, so to speak, on them, since you don't have a lot of control. The more aware you are of a function, the more you can decide, okay, I'm going to work on that function, I'm going to cultivate it, I'm going to groom it. But because of that, we have to accept the idea that NI is not unconscious for an INFJ. NI is totally conscious for an INFJ, because as Jung makes quite clear, the dominant function has to be conscious, regardless of what it is. You take any type, the dominant function is a conscious function, because you just have to picture someone, anyone, regardless of type, whose dominant function will be unconscious. I mean, that person would be a very strange human being. It would mean that the way in which they relate to the world is unconscious. I mean, that doesn't make a lot of sense. So it's conscious. The more your function is low in your stack, the lower it is in your stack, the more unconscious it is. And in fact, the so-called shadow functions, 5th to 8th, if you're familiar with those, are so unconscious for Jung that it actually makes no sense to even try to organize them into a stack at all, because they're too unconscious to be even differentiated. So they cannot really be individualized either. So that's another interesting aspect. But NI takes the information in the outside world through its constant association with SE. SE provides it with the data that it gathers. It identifies so notices the data, gathers it unconsciously, and then sort of NI grabs that and organizes it. And it is the system of organization of the data that SE provides into patterns that is subjective in the case of NI. It's not objective, it's subjective, which is why a lot of NI insights as we know them can sound so strange. But they're not strange because the data itself is strange. The data is always taken from the outside world. There's no other way. It's strange because the interpretation and the patterns and the shape that data is organized in is highly subjective. Now, that doesn't mean it's not valuable or original. Sometimes you need that great dose of subjectivity to think beyond the mere data of the outside world to come up with a highly original and daring thesis in philosophy and psychology as much as in science. And that will be all for today. I hope that was useful. Ciao.